So, with Valentine's Day coming up, I thought I would focus this evening on metta. And in the song, as you probably heard, Tina Turner, that classic song, she says, she asks, what's love got to do with it, right? But, and the answer, though, with metta is, which is loving kindness, that's a Pali for loving kindness, is everything. It is an unconditional love that we radiate outward from our heart center in all directions and without preference or attachment or expectation either of anything in return. And it is not, as in the song, clearly a second-class emotion or a romantic sentiment, but one might say the heart's true valentine, given to the world and to all beings through the power and intention of a deep, selfless caring. Loving kindness, as we know, is also a heart and a concentration practice that gladdens the heart and calms the mind. But in its saturation, when we fill with loving kindness and its integration with mindfulness, and therefore its link to the factors of awakening, which I'll name them in a minute, metta reaches its full flowering and on the direct path to liberation. And this, I think, for some has been a question. In his textual study of the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the Pali for the four foundations of mindfulness, the Venerable Analayo, who's a very young, well, not that young, but very renowned young German scholar, he writes that loving kindness not only provides the proper preparatory ground for the practice of insight meditation, it can also directly contribute to realization. The distinctive character of loving kindness, as taught by the Buddha, lies in combining it with the awakening factors. And the awakening factors are 7. There are the calming factors of tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. And then what they refer to as the arousing factors of investigation, energy, and joy. And they're balanced by mindfulness. So in that, and those factors are often aroused when we actually do go into states of absorption through practices that deepen concentration. So those are referred to or known as the awakening factors, which means that they are factors that we want to cultivate and that contribute as well to our waking up, to our deepening and walking of the path. So they're very powerful, and you can hear there's joy in there, and there's also that calm. So and then he goes on, several discourses, meaning in the canon, the Pali canon, relate the practice of loving kindness in particular to progress from the stage of stream entry, this is in the Theravadan tradition, to that of non-returning. And of course, non-returning in the traditional view is that there are multiple lifetimes, but that's not something that we also have to see it that way either. But clearly, Analayo goes on, the advantages of developing loving kindness are not confined to function as an antidote to anger and irritation, which it certainly is that as well. So loving kindness is also the aspiration and energy which connects us with everything, with the web of our own interconnectivity and the ebb and flow of who we truly are in the moment-to-moment unfolding of our experiencing, where the I is also a we, not isolated or separate, but interdependent, connected, and contingent on the arising and falling of all things. Loving kindness becomes then what we might call the tender middle path of awakening through love. the unconditional loving kindness that helps us also to hear the cries of the world. And in the words of the poet Naomi Shihab Nye, to see, as she says, the size of the cloth, the fullness of it, where only kindness matters. And where the spiritual path leads not only to individual liberation or to the transcendence of suffering of this world, but to the transformation of suffering in this world and the cultivation of a deep ethic of caring. Loving kindness is also the practice that we can most depend on as the antidote to anger and ill will. When the heart breaks, when we feel abandoned or betrayed or unseen and unheard, or when we experience anger or fear or the grief of a deep loss and find ourselves falling apart or turning into a jagged rock. Very little grows on jagged rock, the poet Rumi says. Be ground, be crumbled, so wildflowers will come up where you are. You have been stony too many years. Try something different. Surrender. But to surrender to what is with a love that is unconditional, without reserve, and no holding back, we may have to taste that fear, know the sadness, and let the heart break open fully. And when it does, it is loving kindness that gives us the courage and heartfulness to pick up the pieces and reconnect, to transform our relationship within ourselves and each other, in our letting go and loving of the world. On the day after Christmas, after lunch, with an old friend who I hadn't seen for about 15 years, I found myself wandering the aisles of Barnes & Noble, stopping all of a sudden in front of a row of children's books and looking up at the cover of Charlotte's Web. I don't know if anybody here remembers that book as a child or maybe even as a parent. It was a story everybody remembers, right? It's a classic. It was a story that had been read to me as a child many years ago when I'd been shipped off to a boarding school after my mother had become ill. I didn't remember the details looking at the cover, except that it had been a story about a young girl my age, a spider named Charlotte, and a pig, a runt pig, who, as I now read, was about to be killed. "Where's Papa going with that axe, Fern?" asked her mother. And for a moment, my heart, like Fern, leaped in my chest. Catching my breath, thrown out of Fern's story back into my own, I felt again the gnawing anxiety had been trying to avoid about my very playful, loving, and wise cat, Ting, who had ingested something toxic, stopped eating, and was now at the vet. Wandering through the bookstore that afternoon had provided some momentary relief, but the fear of loss that now gripped my heart was something old and familiar, a dread that had begun to pound against my chest like a visitor knocking at the front door, but someone who I could not, at that moment, invite in or welcome as a friend. In Rumi's poem, The Guest House, he also reminds us this being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. So when a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor, welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. But standing in the bookstore at that moment, I couldn't find the space to greet or welcome the fear, despite knowing, as a student of the Dharma, that this was a guest who knocks on all our doors and was not personal, not me or mine, nor given the events was it even an unexpected guest? Turning away, not able to entertain it, I began to read Kate D. Camilo's foreword to Charlotte's Web instead, where I learned that as a kid, the cover of Charlotte's Web had also made her nervous, so anxious, in fact, that she couldn't read the book until she turned 31 years old. For one thing, she writes, the pig looked worried. For another, the girl seemed stoically resigned to whatever it was that the pig was worried about. Together with a sheep, a goose, and a spider, the worried pig and the resigned girl formed a tableau that virtually guaranteed the reader some sort of misery, and I wanted nothing to do with that. Week after week, year after year, she continues, I glanced at the troubled face of Wilbur in the paperback spin rack. I looked and then I closed my eyes and spun the rack so that the book, the pig, the potential suffering disappeared from my sight. Until, into the throes of full adulthood, Kate D. Camilo was told by her writing teacher that Charlotte's Web was a miracle of storytelling, and that if she really wanted to be a writer, she had to read the book. Feeling shamed, resentful, and more than a little anxious that a story with an axe and a worried pig couldn't possibly turn out well, she finally reads Charlotte's Web and discovers that indeed she was right, that things didn't turn out well, and yet, at the same time, they did. And that the crux of the miracle was that although something terrible, something unbearable happens, we bear this unbearable thing, and in the end, we even rejoice. E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Web, once wrote that all I hope to say in books, all that I ever hope to say, is that I love the world. And to Di Camilo's delight, in her letting go and reading of Charlotte's Web, she also discovers that because every word of Charlotte's Web bears the full weight of White's love for people, seasons, animals, and arachnids of this world, every word shows us how we can also bear the triumph and despairs, the wonder and the heartbreaks, the glories and tragedies of being here. Like E.B. White, she states, we can bear it all by loving it all. But before Di Camilo could live into the fullness of that insight, she had to open the door to embrace her own fear, a fear that could have impoverished her life as a writer, a reader, and possibly her growth as a writer. And so she opens the book and enters into the world of Charlotte's Web, where she encounters not only the anxiety of Fern to save the runt pig, but as the story moves forward, the screams of Wilbur, that he doesn't want to die, when the old sheep tells him flat out that the farmer is just fattening him up to be killed, that he's to be murdered, just like all the other spring pigs in the past, to become smoked ham and bacon. Turning to his best friend Charlotte, hanging from her web overhead, Wilbur asks her if that is true. When she replies that it probably is, since the sheep had been around for a long time, and that it was also the dirtiest trick that she ever heard of, Wilbur bursts into tears and throws himself to the ground. Witnessing his hysterics with a mother's fierce love and impatience, Charlotte then declares that he shall not die and vows on the spot to save Wilbur, without the slightest clue at that moment as to how or when, trusting to patience that as a fly would eventually come to her web, an idea would come to her mind. And so the chapter Bad News turns into the miracle of a later chapter as Charlotte weaves her web and the story of love and loss, of sacrifice and triumph unfolds. Entering into the world of Wilbur's terrible fear and physical trembling, DiCamillo also has to embrace the existential fear and trembling of her own, beyond that of any particular story, of hers, of yours, of mine, and of all beings aware of the vulnerability and contingency of their existence, of our wanting to connect, to belong, to be loved, and to be safe, to not be hurt or to die. In her reading of Charlotte's Web, DiCamillo confronts then not only the possible demise of a sweet pig, but the great matter of life and death itself that runs through Charlotte's Web and through all our stories, to experience in the process the unconditional and loving embrace with which she can hold it all, both the terror and the delight, to come into her own as a writer as well. Through her embrace of the totality of her experiencing, DiCamillo can then also rejoice and open to the joys of her vocation and of her life to be fully lived, with the teaching that by loving it all, we too can let go and open to the freedom that is ours, to embrace whatever arises, to shape a rich and authentic life, loving and living and letting go, opening to the wonder and mystery of the exquisite and tragic dimensions of all existence. This, too, is the teaching of the Buddha on the power of loving kindness, of metta, the aspiration for all beings to be free from suffering, know joy, and live with ease, held in a loving, unconditional, and selfless embrace. As the first of the divine abodes, which you may also know as the Brahma Viharas, loving kindness is foundational as the root and water that nourishes the tree of compassion, and by extension, appreciative joy and equanimity. It is what makes the divine abodes even possible, and infusing each of them with impartiality and their boundlessness, to become our heart center and true home, where we can dwell with safety and with a mindful, loving awareness, attend and befriend all that is. As the boundless heart that cherishes all living beings without preference, metta is also the foundation of our mindfulness and our willingness to stay present, where we can embrace the immediacy and fullness of our experiencing, the suffering of our wanting and not wanting, of our grasping and clinging, of our meing and mying, to let go with greater ease and see into the nature of things and into the goodness of each other. Loving kindness is also that field of loving, in the words of Rumi, beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, where we can meet ourselves and each other with a spacious and loving acceptance. Metta is also then the foundation of our responsibility to act, to shape a wise and compassionate response, deepening our connection with ourselves, each other, and the world. Likened to a gentle rain that falls without preference on the earth, metta is also the love that is moist, that binds us all together. As a skillful means, as a practice, to deepening samadhi, as described by Buddhaghosa in the Visuddhimagga, or Path of Purification, that was written in the 5th century AD, 800 years after the Buddha's death, approximately. Metta is a powerful practice, warm and cherishing, that binds us closely with the object of our attention, and in this way links to mindfulness and the other calming and arousing factors of awakening, essential to the actualization of the Eightfold Path. The calming factors, again, of tranquility, concentration, and equanimity, and the arousing factors of investigation, energy, and joy. But through his scholarship and focus on early Buddhism, which is actually quite a bit of work being done in that area these days, and the works of later commentaries and modern scholarship, Analayo emphasizes, this is the Venerable Analayo again, the direct contribution of metta to realization, whether we are transitioning out of a deep state of absorption, which may be even a jhana state, or in the midst of the conflict and pain of our daily life, as it is also described in the suttas, whether, quote, being verbally insulted or even physically maltreated, or like, quote, the Brahmin on his deathbed suffering from agonizing severe stomach cramps and high fever, who dies and is reborn in the Brahma world after practicing metta. The three groupings, shifting now to the Eightfold Path for a moment, the three groupings of wisdom, ethics, and concentration, which make up the Eightfold Path, that lead to the cessation of suffering, beginning, as we may know, with right speech, right view. And right here is also not what we might think of as right versus wrong, right or wrong in some sort of moralistic perspective. Right is often, or sama, that word sama, is often also translated as complete or whole or thorough. So the reference here is not quite right or wrong. It is more of that complete, that fullness of view, the broadening of the understanding. So in that regard, also right view, followed by right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration are all embedded in what may be the Buddha's earliest teaching on metta, in the 10 verses of the beloved Karanaya Metta Sutta, that we probably have all heard at some point. In the last 4 stanzas of that sutta, we hear, even as a mother protects her child with her life, her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness. One should sustain this mindfulness. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. In those last 4 stanzas, we can also hear a description again of the path. The phrase, not born again into this world, points to the possibility of full awakening, but without our also having to buy into the Indian cosmological or metaphysical view of multiple lifetimes. Through the cultivation, enfolding, and integration of metta and mindfulness, we can grow a love so strong, boundless, and inclusive that we can create a mind-like space. The Buddha's instruction to his own son, Rahula, the space and spaciousness of a radiant, boundless, and loving container, which is an abode and an abiding. a mind-like space that also becomes the loving space or abode where we can embrace our reactivity and see clearly what's clearly visible here and now. As in the Buddha's teaching to a man named Sivaka, who asked about his teaching of a dharma that is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting, to be personally experienced by the wise. The Buddha's teaching points to the possibility of waking up in this moment and the next, and in this world, quoting, saying, when we know those qualities of mind associated with greed, hatred, and delusion are present within us, and when they are absent and not within us, and asking Sivaka if he knew that to be true. And Sivaka said yes. So therefore, clearly visible. When we know there is a sadness and not a sadness, when we know there is a joy and not a joy, and any emotion, image, or thought that we may be clinging to, that keeps us stuck and feeds our delusion of being a fixed and separate self. In those moments of our knowing and letting go of what is not permanent, not a source of lasting satisfaction, and not self, we can also let go into the freedom and fearlessness of possibility, with the open, non-reactive comprehension of a mind-like space, which is also an ethical space where we can embrace the uncertainty and contingency of our existence in the actualization of our becoming more fully human, to create, in the teaching of Stephen Batchelor, an inclusive culture of caring, compassion, and awakening. According to legend described by Buddhaghosa, the Buddha first taught the Karanaya Metta Sutta as an antidote to fear to 500 monks who, in the tradition of the 4-month annual rain retreat, he'd sent out to find a secluded dwelling in the foothills of the Himalayas, where they could abide in peace and in deep meditation. Journeying forth, the monks found a hill that was described as, that appeared, and it's described this way, like glittering blue quartz crystal, with a dense green forest grove and a clean spring of cool water. They were captivated by the sight and so welcomed by the townspeople in a nearby village from whom they could receive alms, that the 500 monks accepted their invitation to stay, moving into the huts the villagers built and selecting trees under which each could sit to meditate in peace day and night. But when the tree deities, whose celestial mansions inhabited the trees, discovered that the monks intended to stay more than a night or two, they felt dispossessed of their homes and decided to drive them away, which they did, with 500 monks fleeing in droves back to the Buddha, telling tales of ghoulish visions, horrible shrieks, and wrenching smells that not only disrupted their peace, but terrified them utterly, crying out to the Buddha to please find them another spot. The Buddha listened deeply to their cries, but scanning the whole of India with his supernatural powers, this is a legend, he couldn't find another suitable place for their spiritual awakening, and finally said, "Monks, go back to the same spot. It is only by striving there that you will effect the destruction of your inner taints. Fear not. If you want to be free from the harassment caused by the deities, learn this." And recited for the first time the Karanaya Metta Sutta, which he then taught the monks to recite, to meditate, contemplate, and deeply embody as a practice and as a form of protection from inner and outer harm. And so they did. Returning to the forest, practicing metta, the monks transformed their relationship to their fears and to the tree deities, who they not only befriended, but who had also become their benefactors and protectors. Freed from the ill will of outer harm from others, and from predators in the forest, the lions, tigers, or snakes, who could hurt them. Saturated with the full flowering of metta and its joy for themselves, each other, and for all beings, the monks could also dwell in the supreme abiding of the sustained mindfulness of full awakening, free from the inner taints of greed, hatred, and delusion, the reactivity that feeds our fear and trembling, the existential angst of our being fully human. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, the sutta says, we can do metta anywhere, a teaching which I then remembered walking through Barnes and Noble, trying to not think about our cat Ting, and not able to think about anything else. Walking, worrying, wanting to hold and protect him, but radiating waves of anxiety, not able to hold or extend love to myself, cut off with the fear of loss and the angst that I couldn't help him and that I might have even failed him. Until I read the words of Kate DiCamillo that we can bear it all by loving it all. And taking a few deep breaths, sat down and started again, inviting the cool, light rain of metta to fall on me, on Ting, and on all beings, riding the waves with unconditional love and deepened presence. But as the story in Charlotte's Web, things did not turn out well, and we finally had to let go of Ting, with the ache of all the love that we had to hold him. That morning, a red-tailed hawk crashed into a south-facing window, fell back, stunned, then gathered himself and flew away low beneath the trees, while I fell on the wet tile of the bathroom floor above and sustained a serious contusion to my right foot. Then a week later, a dear friend died, also a shock after the same brief life and death struggle of his own. Then my husband's mom, with whom I was very close, died a week after that. And the world seemed to flip on its axis, tearing a rent in the sky and in our hearts, forcing us to be ground, be crumbled, with no choice but to surrender. In the parable of the mustard seed, the young woman, Kisa Gotami, becomes inconsolable and nearly mad, unable to accept the death of her infant son and only child, and carries the boy, the baby, with her everywhere, pleading for help to bring him back to life. When she is sent to the Buddha, he tells her that he will prepare a cure if she can collect a mustard seed from a house that hasn't been touched by death. But as Kisa Gotami goes knocking door to door, she learns that death had been a visitor everywhere, and that death is not only what may bring us all to our knees, to be ground, it is what also helps us to wake up, to water the wildflowers in our heart for them to bloom and flourish again, which for Kisa Gotami became a dedication to practice and the attainment of full awakening in her life. In a recent interview with the Venerable Analyo again, he shared that when he was doing comparative studies, when he removed the meditation exercises that were not common to all three versions of the sutta, the Satipatthana Sutta. The remaining contemplations were, quote, not about using the body to be mindful. Rather, they were to deepen our understanding of the corporal and compounded natures of our bodies as a path to insight. Normally, he said, we look at the body and see it as me. But these texts are asking us to take that apart and see that actually we are made of earth, water, fire and wind, of hardness, fluidity, wetness, temperature, and motion. They are asking us to directly confront our own mortality, to contemplate the most threatening thing for us, death. The threat that also feeds our existential angst. Through the enfolding of loving kindness with mindfulness, we then not only create the space where we can abide, to embrace our suffering, to feel the full measure of our grief and let go. We also create the space or abode where we can dwell in the deep caring and embodied contemplation of death itself. Whereas, for example, in the Tibetan tradition, we may recite, meditate, contemplate, and digest the phrases that death is certain, but the time of death uncertain, and ask, what should I do? To open to the knowledge of who we truly are and to the fullness of life and embrace it. To bear the unbearable and awaken to the beauty and the mystery of our connection with all things and our insight into what truly is clearly visible and to what truly matters. Bearing the unbearable, it is Wilbur who gets to live, to be safe and finally triumphant, with a medal hanging on his neck because of the weavings that had miraculously appeared on Charlotte's web that saved him by bringing him to the attention of the world. But his joy of that moment is short-lived, as he finds his beloved Charlotte clinging to the rafters, dying, exhausted from her labors to save him, and from weaving her last great work, her egg sac containing 514 baby spiders. Out of his grief and even greater love for Charlotte, Wilbur vows to save her babies, which he does, only to watch them leave one by one after they hatched and with spring in the air begin to spin their balloons of fine silk and sail away. Except for the 3 who decided to stay. And as time wore on, Wilbur had a new crop of friends, Charlotte's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And although he never forgot Charlotte and her own fierce mother's love for him, life in the barn was very good. Night and day, winter and summer, spring and fall, dull days and bright days. It was the best place to be, thought Wilbur, this warm, delicious cellar with the garrulous geese, the changing seasons, the heat of the sun, the passage of swallows, the nearness of rats, the sameness of sheep, the love of spiders, the smell of manure, and the glory of everything. And so, the power of loving kindness, in its deepened integration with mindfulness, and the native wisdom that we can bear it all by loving it all, even the great matter of life and death for a runt pig, a spider, and each one of us, for all beings whose nature it is to be born and to die. So whether we become saturated with metta on a brief or lengthy retreat like the 500 monks, with the hindrances temporarily suppressed, or through its infusion of the divine abodes. Or we experience metta as a light rain in our daily lives. The power of each drop will fill and protect us from greed, hatred, and delusion, and open the path to freedom. When we extend goodwill to the driver who just cut us off, or to the politician, we can maybe name a few, who spew hatred, or to someone who may be suffering, whether they are a friend or not, or even to ourselves as an endearment when we feel isolated, cut off, or have pain in our body, or simply have made a mistake. We not only cultivate our own basic goodness as we aspire to see the goodness in others, but also change, we know this even more fully now, our own neural pathways and our perceptual field itself. The devil, or Mara, as we know, is in the detail, and it is the small drops of metta that matter. Cultivating the wisdom and ethics of caring is the path to letting go and waking up. Even if these loving, mindful moments of liberation are impermanent, Analyo emphasizes temporary states of mental freedom are integral aspects of the path, which contribute directly to liberation. Our abiding in the space and spacious loving of mindful awareness also leads to the surrender and into the deeper truths of the Dharma, of our connection with the earth and all beings, and with the insight that everything is impermanent, with no fixed self, fully contingent, and deeply interconnected, deeply interdependent and interconnected. It is also, finally, the loving space where we can abide, to respond more fully to the cries of the heart, to create a culture of caring, connection, and awakening. And in the words of Martin Luther King, move with dignity and discipline, using only the weapons of love. With the elixir, I would add, of metta and mindfulness, the most powerful love potion of all. But as we close, and we definitely won't have time, but as we close, Rumi reminds us our task, or the poem reads, your task is not to seek for love, but to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. And the challenge of extending metta for many of us, whether we are in a dark place or not, is sending it first to ourselves, filling our own heart space with love and joy as a source to radiate it fully outward to others. And so as we close, I had hoped that we could take some time to do a very brief 3-part practice here, but I can see we're already 5 after 9. But I would welcome you to consider that how busy or whatever our schedules may be, and sometimes may not find the time to sit or to do practice, or when we travel. If there's one practice that many and most of my own teachers recommend that is of great value, it is metta. So let's take a moment and pause. And perhaps we could just do this piece. May we all be filled with loving kindness. May we all be peaceful and at ease. May we all be happy. May we all be well. Namaste.